When people lead with their creativity, they generate purpose and meaning in their work, and they consistently drive business value. I'm Dr. Natalie Nixon, and I change lives with ideas. I'm a creativity strategist, the president of Figure 8 Thinking, a global keynote speaker, and the author of the award-winning book, The Creativity Leap. I advise leaders on transformation by applying wonder and rigor to amplify their business value. And I do that in two ways, through the lenses of creativity and foresight. Some of the questions that my clients have would be, what's the business that we should be in versus the business that we've been churning in? And how do we figure out our meaning and our purpose? There are two types of experiences I offer: keynote speaking and advisory services. I'm a global keynote speaker, and I'm often hired by CHROs, chief strategy officers, and chief innovation officers, as well as event planners to deliver a keynote at your next event. I also offer strategic advisory sessions, both one-on-one as well as Foresight Studios for your teams. Nothing makes me happier than when my clients get those aha moments where they self-identify as creative and they understand that creativity is actually the essential engine for innovation. That's the power of applying creativity, toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. I help you shift your paradigm to amplify your business value. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. My name is Natalie Nixon. Welcome to the WonderRigor podcast, where we delve into a range of topics Tuesdays from 12 p.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And today, I'm going to start out our first 30 minutes today diving into an article that I wrote for Katie Couric Media. It was published back in January. And the name of the article is Downsizing Requires You to Right-Size Your Mind. And so I'd like to share some of the highlights from that article because unfortunately, downsizing is still a pertinent issue, something that's really top of mind for a lot of us, especially around murmurings of recession or realities of recession that are hitting various industries, especially the tech sector, where a lot of people are dealing with the ramifications of layoffs. And what I want to share are some of the mental models that we can experiment with and adopting so that we can better navigate that kind of rocky terrain of layoffs and recession. So again, I think Morgan is going to put a link in the footer for you if you're interested in reading up on the article. But that's what I'm going to talk about for the first 15 minutes. And then we're going to be joined by my friend and colleague, Tonya Ladipo. Tonya is the CEO of the Ladipo Group, and she's going to be talking about psychological safety in organizations, which has some adjacent connection to the topic of our mindset and our mental models in the midst of recessionary times. So in the article for Katie Couric Media, I was exploring this question of how can we become invaluable at work? And one of the things about all of the bad news about layoffs and recessions is that bad news can become a bit of a contagion. And there is this reality in physics, something called the butterfly effect. It's something that a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz, he coined this term butterfly effect when he was tinkering with weather forecasting models almost 50 years ago. And when he was developing these models, he learned that tiny, minute fluctuations in his mathematical model could produce huge, unpredictable effects in his weather forecasting. So he was really dipping into systems change. So the butterfly effect is this notion, this reality that the flapping of a butterfly's wings, say in the Amazon jungle, could have a cascading effect in the system and the weather system to cause a tsunami say, in Sri Lanka. So similarly, news can spread like that. And there's a Stanford Business School professor named Jeffrey Pfeffer who has been quoted as believing that some of the layoffs that we've seen of late are in some ways a phenomenon of copycat behavior, which does not make it easier for people who are dealing with the effects of those layoffs. But I want to share two sorts of mindsets that we can think about when we're talking about rumors of downsizing. One persona I called caught off guard Kathy, and the other persona is anticipating Amy. So I want to dive into some of the ways we can approach our work to hopefully be relevant as much as possible in the midst of recessionary times. The first sort of mindset that the persona anticipating Amy has is that she becomes really comfortable with asking questions. Now, I've spoken in a lot of other forums about how a lot of us don't necessarily work in environments where questions are welcomed, or we don't feel comfortable asking questions. And that's because a lot of us have gone through a form of question shaming, where either early on in our educational experiences or on the job, we experienced being ignored if we raised our hand and asked a question, or even worse, kind of laughter or giggle. So we get the message early on not to ask a lot of questions. But the advice here is not that you ask a torrent of questions, but that you're brave enough to raise your hand when you need clarification on something, when you need to ask for more context about direction that you're being given. And so when you ask a question, sometimes that tells a lot more about your contributions to a group effort, even than your answers, because your ability to ask a question, probably other people have a similar question, so you're helping your colleagues, and B, it says a lot more about the quality of your mind and your thinking, which can be incredibly valuable for the entire group. So asking questions all along the way and building that capacity in your work is really important. The second recommendation I gave in this article was to embrace prototyping internally as a team and to offer up and to encourage your team members to prototype. So what is a prototype? A prototype is a rough draft concept of an idea. It can be in the form of a doodle. It can be in the form of, if you're really brave, role playing, acting out a customer service interaction, videotaping it with your smartphone device. And then here's the most important thing about prototypes: getting feedback. And what we know is that organizations and companies that build in prototyping into the ways that they work ultimately save not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of dollars in avoiding mistakes, because you are getting clarifying questions, back to that first point about questions, earlier and often. And if you are the person who's brave enough to recommend that your team prototype something, that you jump in to volunteer to prototype something, that's an invaluable skill, and it will pay off in terms of cost savings for the organization, because you're willing to build, test, learn, and really starting to turn and re-steering the direction of the metaphorical ship of your organization to challenge the assumptions and making sure that you are learning about roadblocks and fallacies and mistakes earlier rather than later. So prototyping internally and suggesting prototypes, volunteering to prototype. So prototypes, again, they can range from a rough scribble scratch doodle that, again, that you're asking feedback on, a role playing that's being recorded, asking feedback for that, all the way to the point of developing pop-up shops to really demonstrate experiences with the product, service, or experience that your company is selling. The third piece of advice is to work with rigor. Now, working with rigor is not the same as working rigidly. And sometimes my clients believe that they've been working rigorously, but in fact, they've been working a bit rigidly. And here's the difference. When we work rigidly, all alarm bells may be going off, red flags may be being raised, and we are insistent on following through on the course, even though we're getting all the signals that we need to shift course. Working with rigor is when we are much more adaptive to the surrounding landscape and we're willing to say, okay, this is not working. This assumption is being challenged. Customers are not responding well to this new tweak in our offering. The team isn't working great. And we pause and we reorganize, we pivot, right? So working with rigor is about working with focus and discipline and spending time on a task. And so if you are able to make the space and time to work with rigor, but you can do heads down work and ask for that, then your work product will reflect that value. The fourth recommendation is to identify partnerships that you can explore in the workplace. There is an African proverb which says, alone fast, together further. And so converting that first recommendation of asking better questions into asking for help is super important. You don't need to contain yourself to your immediate team, but learning to ask for help from people in other departments, people who work laterally to you, people who are senior to you. You're building scaffolding of support and you're building a network within your organization that hopefully can be helpful in the event of any sort of tumultuous fall and trouble that the organization is going through economically. The last recommendation is to commit to invisible work. Now, invisible work is something that I wrote about in a Fast Company article, and Morgan may add that article, that link to the chat. But invisible work is a term that I made up, not related to the feminist view of invisible work, not related to the unpaid labor that women often do, but it relates to any activity that sparks different neural synapses that are not part of the frontal neocortex or cognitive load. When we step away from churning through email, when we step away from the Zoom meeting, and we're doing activities that actually activate the default neural network in our brain, that actually sparks productivity. So those activities include rest, daydreaming, movement, going for a walk. So any sort of ways that you can engage in invisible work will help you to show up to the work at hand much more revived and much more refreshed. And so we have now the link to that article in the chat, which comes from Fast Company Magazine. And I see Taryn Fletcher has joined us. Thank you so much for being here, Taryn. And you know Tonya, awesome. So please stay tuned for Tonya, who will be joining us in a couple of minutes. So those were the highlights of that Katie Couric Media article I wrote. Again, it's called Downsizing Requires You to Right Size Your Mind. And it especially requires us to right size our mind if we have been laid off. It helps us to reorient ourselves to first deal with the blow and then to identify what are the highlights and key takeaways of the experiences that I've gathered along the way, of the people who I've been able to work with, and how can I continue to stay connected? How can I continue to have this balance of connection and also gaining perspective and reflection? But take a look at that article, and I would love to get your feedback about ways that it's relevant to you. Okay, let's see if Tonya is joining us yet. Morgan, do we have Tonya yet? Not yet. Okay. I would love to know if there are any questions from anyone who's been able to join us today. Um, and Morgan, if you have a clarifying question, that would be great as well. The other article that I wanted to share about today, in addition to downsizing requires you to right size your mind, is an article that I wrote that went into our LinkedIn Ever Wonder newsletter about something I call like life products and like life services and experiences. And so when the way I came up with this idea of making sure that whatever the work that you do, that it mimics like life for your customers, came about when I was a professor. And this was some years ago now, so hopefully things have really advanced and changed. But one of the things I would observe is that the ways that we were asking students to register for classes had become a bit archaic, and they didn't mimic a lot of the ways that we experienced, for example, going to a movie. And so we'll put the link into the Like Life article for you to see ways that you can make sure that the way you're delivering your services and products and experiences are like life. So if you can go see a movie easily through an app, why aren't you offering that ease of use in the products and services you use? Okay, so Tonya is here. Can we bring Tonya on? Awesome. Hey, Tonya.
Hi, Natalie. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And you have a fan, Taryn Fletcher, who joined, and she was really excited to see that you were going to be joining me today. So welcome.
So unfortunately,
sorry, Tonya, you're on mute. Make sure you unmute yourself.
This is perfect. Go. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I first wanted to start by asking you to introduce yourself and the work that you do as CEO of the Ladipo Group.
Yes, thank you. So Tonya Ladipo of the Ladipo Group, and I'm actually a licensed clinical social worker by training. So many years ago, I worked in community mental health and didn't like what I was seeing as a therapist. I saw people who looked like me get horrible treatment. And after talking to management, didn't get responses. So I decided to go out on my own and start a practice of therapy for the Black and African-American communities. And so I did that for several years, hired a great team of therapists to work with me. And then in 2010, I really expanded to do consulting work because I realized a lot of the clients that were coming to us, a huge source of stress was the workplace. And not getting opportunities in the workplace, not being treated fairly. And so we started doing consulting with organizations to really look at how do you build workplaces where everyone has the same opportunities to shine, and how do you support people as they need to be supported. So that has been great work that I enjoy doing with organizations, and kind of really getting in and understanding what their culture is like and what shifts they need to make to enhance it. And kind of really getting to know people and helping people change in ways that help them grow as individuals, but also benefit the organization as well.
Well, it sounds like you're approaching it from a systems perspective. Before you joined us, I was talking about the butterfly effect. I was sharing some highlights from an article I wrote about the mental models we need to adopt in a recessionary environment, and ways that we can try to remain relevant by asking questions, by asking for support, by understanding that fear is a contagion, by adopting prototyping and all sorts of things that I shared in this article. So I think it's actually kind of a cool segue to hear the ways that you shifted your business model to away from only one-to-one therapeutic counseling to looking at the kind of the systemic root causes and looking at the organization as well.
Yes. And, when you just mentioned, as you were talking, Natalie, the word fear, I really kind of latched onto that word fear. Because I think it's an experience so many of us have that we don't talk about. Fear of what is different to us, fear of what is unknown, fear of not succeeding, fear of getting it wrong, fear of being irrelevant as times
Yes.
change.
I'm
And
nodding
so,
my head to all of those fears. I experience variations of that every day. Yes.
right, right. And then what do we do with those fears that can really help us to grow? Or it helps us to shrink and like really become inhibited. And so I appreciate that word. It doesn't feel good to me, at least.
No.
But I think it's important to have awareness about it.
Right. The awareness is significant because it's not about, as you said, shrinking away from it, but acknowledging it. It means that our heart, mind, and body are connected. When we have those emotions,
Yes.
we're able to name them. Well, you and I were talking earlier about one of the ways that you frame your work in terms of psychological safety, which is not something I'm familiar with. So would you just explain what psychological safety is and how you bring that into your work and working with your clients?
Mm-hmm. So psychological safety really is in the workplace, especially, right, is a concept that people are able to contribute, to ask questions, to do their work without fear of retribution. So it means that you can make suggestions and you're not going to be penalized or humiliated, right? That you can say something that, some people might think is a wild idea and nobody's going to be like, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard, right? Because, and as you know, with all of your work, right, creativity thrives when there's space. And when there's a fear of humiliation or retribution for pointing out a problem, and maybe the manager didn't like that you pointed it out, and so like you're not going to get a great performance rating, then you don't speak up again, right? You don't,
Right.
which really limits the amount of like things that can be generated, the ideas that can come. If you don't talk about the wild ideas, you're going to end up doing the same thing, which means that you're going to be irrelevant, right? And so that psychological safety is like the foundation of kind of team creativity. And it's the
Yes.
foundation of effective workplaces, because what it also means when you have an environment that is psychologically safe, it means that you can ask questions. It means you can be curious. It means you can say when you don't know or understand something. And so we can do this about projects and ideas, and we can also do it about humans and people, right? So when we think about especially a global workforce and now with remote work, right? We are working with different people more than we ever have, right? So different races, different ethnicities, religions, genders, so many, right?
Ages.
Ages. Oh my gosh, right? 5 generations of working in the workforce right now. So much diversity that of different experiences. And so to have a workplace that values how you think, Natalie, and that values how I think and values how the other person thinks, even if it's completely different, and then can hone the best of all of us into one direction, like that is gold. And so, I
Mhm.
really think people managers, I was telling you this earlier, right? People managers have so much power. Because they control a lot of the projects that get assigned. They control, promotion or not. They can create a psychologically safe environment, or they can be the key factor in making sure that it's not safe.
Right.
And so it's a big responsibility that I think it can definitely be done. It just takes, I think, information and action, right? You need to know what it
Yes.
is. You need to know how to do it. And then you have to fight through the fear that you might have and be courageous and do
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, well, thank you for framing it in that way. That's exactly what I'm talking about when I earlier in our half hour today, I was talking about, from the article that I referenced, that I wrote, I was talking about one of the recommendations is ask a better question. But I pointed out that many of us have been question shamed, right? Somewhere along our
Yes.
educational experiences, early on in the job, where we dared to raise our hand, and we were giggled, we heard giggles, or even worse, we were ignored. And that then carries forward into work environments where maybe you don't have management that shares more transparently questions that they are starting to have about the new marketing strategy, the different financial model that's about to be launched. So what I always remind managers and leaders is that building a culture of inquiry and curiosity, what it doesn't look like is to say to people, okay, guys, give me your best questions, because people have been question shamed. They don't have the psychological safety you've just outlined. But it starts by modeling that behavior of self-inquiry and curiosity, which emboldens people around you to ask the questions as well.
I love that.
Thank you, Roshana, for joining us. She's added a wonderful comment, much needed information. Thank you a lot. Thank you for joining us. You're welcome. So in the couple of minutes that we've remaining, this is called the WonderRigor podcast, where I always like to interweave ways that wonder and rigor are relevant to my guests' work and perspective. So just to recap, the way I define creativity is that it's our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, produce novel value, and generate meaning. And wonder is about audacity and deep curiosity and blue sky thinking. And rigor is about focus, skill mastery, time on task. And I remind people that all creative work needs both the wonder and the rigor. Sometimes we think creativity is doing whatever you feel like, and it's just the wonder. Not at all. It also requires that very focused, convergent thinking as well as the divergent thinking. So any thoughts you want to share as we close about the ways that wonder and or rigor show up in your work in general, show up in psychological safety more specifically?
I love how those two words, how you put those words together, because you're right, both are needed. And so I think I'm going to say a little bit personally, and then for the organization, I think personally, so I walk a lot, and I walk outside because I'm looking at the trees and hearing the sounds, and like, it's a space to let my mind and space breathe. Right. And then I come back to my office, and then I gather my thoughts, and then I put it together. And so I feel like that constant practice of a cyclical nature, of kind of putting that together to really, that's how the new ideas come, right? But if I'm sitting at my desk for 8 hours straight, I might be checking email and checking tasks off, but like, there's no creativity really happening without.
I'm smiling broadly because you're literally picking up the example of invisible work that I was referencing earlier.
Okay.
Right. Well, invisible work is when we step away from the laptop and we move, we walk, we daydream. It's activating the default neural synapses mode in our brain that helps the better ideas to emerge when we go back to the laptop. So thanks for that. That's awesome.
Yes. And I'm glad you said that. I love that, because when we work with, when I'm talking to people, especially people who are leaders, kind of getting them to understand, like, this is going to taking a break makes your work better. Go on vacation and don't open the laptop. You're going to come back much more creative, much more focused, right? Like, it's not either or, it's both and.
Right.
Yeah. And so something, that we do in our own organization that I always encourage people I work with to do is, excellence with ease. Like, that's our motto. That's our tagline. How can you give the best of yourself and the best work with ease, so that you're not working 12-hour days, like that you are taking, I want to hear that my team is running a few minutes late to meet with me because they just had to get some fresh air. I'm good, because you're going to come back and we're going to have a better meeting, 5 minutes less and a better meeting. I'm going to take that. And so I like the idea of kind of putting it together. And The last thing I'll say that is important to me is the point of self-reflection and action. It's a cyclical process. You pause, you think, you take action. You pause, you think, you take action. So I feel like that's how they go together.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tonya, for joining us. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yes, you can go to our website, theladipogroup.com. We have a podcast, Managing Well, where I'm talking to people managers about how to develop psychological safety with their teams. So you can find all of that on our website.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was just the right rich examples that we needed to kind of buffer everything that I said at the top of the half hour. So thank you, Tonya.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll be back next Tuesday from 12 o'clock to 12:30 Eastern. Bye.